All right, implicit processing. Okay, so I've grabbed this picture of apples at the grocery store to illustrate a study that was conducted, I don't know, 50 years ago now, where people were shown a pile of apples like they're set up at a grocery store. And then they're shown another picture where the apples are all over the floor. So any of us who know how the world works, our assumption is probably going to be that, somebody pulled the wrong apple out and they all fell down. That's a very logical conclusion. But it wasn't part of the pictures that were provided. We have a picture of all the apples in the display, and then we have the next picture being all the apples on the floor. Implicit processing is that kind of processing where we kind of unconsciously, implicit is kind of another word for unconscious, but without awareness, process aspects of the cues or the stimuli and draw inferences about those things without meaning to, but our brain just automatically draws inferences. We oftentimes mistakenly believe that we have observed, not just inferred, the process. And so in that study, the people who saw the apples on the pile, then saw them on the floor, remembered seeing someone pull the apple, and they remember there being a third picture that showed somebody pulling an apple. There was no third picture. You only saw two pictures. How can you possibly think you saw a picture that depicted somebody pulling the apple out? But people thought that because how else did the apples get on the floor? Of course I saw somebody pull the apple, obviously. They think that they have observed something that in fact they only inferred. So they see the beginning state, they see the end state, and they infer the in-between and come to believe that they actually observed that. These are what we call after-the-fact reconstructions, where now that we know that the apples are on the floor, our brain goes, well, how would apples go from being in a neatly stacked pile to being on the floor? Obviously, somebody pulled an apple, right? That's an after-the-fact reconstruction. A lot of times they're accurate. I mean, probably the best explanation for why the apples were on the floor is that somebody pulled the wrong one out. Like that, it's the explanation that makes the most sense, but it's not always the correct answer. And so again, this is sort of like using heuristics, which we've talked about before, right? If you use heuristics, they oftentimes are accurate. I mean, that's why we continue to use them, is that they oftentimes give us good answers, but not always. And actually where we get really interested in cognitive psychology is the times that people make mistakes. A lot of times after the fact reconstructions are based on generic knowledge. So our generic knowledge of how apples are stacked, our generic knowledge of how gravity works. So it isn't that we've ever seen Uncle Fred pull an apple, but we just know that if you were to pull the wrong one, there's a high probability that a lot of them would fall down. And so that kind of generic knowledge helps to feed after the fact reconstructions. You don't need specific knowledge in order to make this kind of reconstruction. Our conscious judgments and inferences are fast, efficient, and reasonable. Just like heuristic devices, our unconscious judgments give us that little boost because, I mean, the theme of cognition is that we would rather be fast than be right. If we had to sacrifice one of those two things, we would sacrifice accuracy. So we make fast decisions. Typically, this is a really good strategy because we typically make efficient and reasonable decisions when we rely on our unconscious judgments. There are situations where we need to stop and think carefully, but those are actually in your day. Think about all the things you do all day. If you were to keep like a legitimate diary of every single thing you do, or every decision, everything you touch, everything that you pick up, everything that you pass, you have a series of unconscious judgments going on every day, all day. And so thank goodness most of it can be done unconsciously and not take away from the cognitive capacity that you could dedicate to things that actually need more attention. And, being correct is more important and things like that. When we're making unconscious judgments, we think in cognitive psychology, we assume that the person is relying on, cues in the situation, maybe prior habits that have, gone the same way every time, familiarity with the situation. And you can imagine that with this apple pulling example, right? Situational cues, familiarity with gravity, prior habits. Maybe when you go grocery shopping, not to pull the bottom apple out. Pull one from the top of the pile. These kinds of things help us to make good unconscious decisions. But there is a role for control. There are situations where we need to not be just going with our unconscious judgments. We can think of our unconscious processes as sort of like mental reflexes, things that, given the proper stimulation, this is going to be your unconscious response to it. These tend to be really guided by circumstances, like whatever's going on right now is usually the thing that's going to trigger an unconscious process. They generally tend to be pretty inflexible. Like whatever unconscious process has worked in this type of situation in the past is the one that you're probably going to use again. It's what you do, given this kind of stimulus or whatever. Sometimes unconscious processes can trigger action slips, which we talked about in our earlier chapters on memory. But just as a reminder, those are those cases where you plan to do one thing, but you end up doing something else. Like your intention had been to go into the garage to go to the spare refrigerator and get a new pound of butter out, but instead you got into the garage, you got distracted by something, and you did what you normally do when you get in the garage and you're like, oh, I think I'm going to work out for a second. And then next thing you know, you forget to do the thing you intended and you're doing what you usually do in the garage. That actually happened to be a real life example. But anyway, when trying to do something different, you often end up doing what is normal and habitual. And my favorite example of that is how often I look down at my gas gauge, say, you know what, I need to stop and get gas on my way home from work. And I'll blithely drive past 2-3 gas stations on my way home and find myself on the driveway and go, dang it, forgot to stop and get gas. Because it's not something that you do that often, right? I drive back and forth to school. Probably I can make probably a solid month without having to fuel up my tank. And because I only drive 8 miles each way. And so it's a pretty, I don't use a lot of gas. So, I mean, something that you do once a month, as opposed to something that you do every single day, yeah, you kind of go with the habitual, right? And those can trigger action slips. Unconscious processes can operate without supervision. So I put supervision in quotation marks because, I guess our conscious brain is our supervisor. But, one of the things that's nice about having these unconscious processes is that you can run several of them at the same time. So you can maybe have in the background some kind of unconscious reasoning going on while you're consciously thinking about what to have for dinner, something like that. And so it allows you to, divide your attention. Let some unconscious stuff go on. One of my best examples of something more unconscious is that I can wait to hear the beeper on my dryer, and all I need is that thing to sort of penetrate my consciousness. So I can technically be tracking that without having to actually devote any conscious cognitive resources to that. Right? The tone will be meaningful enough to pull my unconscious process, and then my unconscious process will be like, hey, the dryer's done. So that frees up some of your cognitive resources, which is really efficient. So how do these things run without supervision? Well, there's, the biological explanations are that, your nervous system was built to be able to do some things without needing conscious awareness. And then the other aspect is that with practice, some things that started off being very conscious can become automated. I'm going to refer back to this picture as an example of a type of thing that starts off very effortful, driving, that can become automated to the point where you can now do that. Probably if you've been doing it for a few years, you can actually drive and allow your unconscious processes to handle most of the things. When I first learned to drive, I was driving a stick. And so I had to shift all the time. And when I first was learning to drive, it was crazy. I was like, I couldn't track shifting, turning on my blinker, looking left and right. I couldn't handle all the things that were coming at me all at one time. And with just a little bit of experience, it very quickly became that shifting was an unconscious process. I could do it without thinking about it at all. Like something in my brain was tracking the sound of the engine and would trigger my left leg to push down on the clutch, shift the gear with my right hand, let the clutch back out. Like it just was taking care of it on its own. And if you had to explain to somebody, like I just tried to do, explain to somebody who doesn't drive a stick how exactly you do it. I mentioned putting my left foot on the clutch and kind of forgot to mention as your left foot's going down on the clutch, you're kind of letting off on the gas pedal a little bit. And then as you're releasing the clutch, you're kind of pushing on the gas pedal again. So there's all this stuff that's going on, two different feet doing two different things. You know, my left hand is steering and my right hand is shifting the gear. And all of it became unconscious and dependent on my hearing the sound of the engine, right? And that was being done unconsciously. Like I could carry on a conversation and still hear the sound of the engine. That's the kind of thing we're talking about with the benefits of practice. So yeah, your brain has a certain capacity for being able to do these things, but practice is probably the most important fact for establishing, you know, this sort of unsupervised cognition that can be occurring. All right. I think I've been talking for long enough, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here. We'll come back and talk about, well, what does it take to start asserting control over our cognitions?